Hey everyone, Dom here. In this snippet, we are going to talk about two functions, throttle and debounce. These two functions are often confused with each other. They achieve mostly the same thing, but sometimes throttle gets confused for debounce and vice versa. Additionally, utility functions like these and others that are often found in packages like lodash and underscore are very common interview questions. It is often that an interviewer will ask you about implementing array manipulation or object manipulation or throttle and debounce. So I definitely will be making more videos like this in the future, so don't forget to like and subscribe. So let's talk about what throttle and debounce are and their differences. I will actually reference an article here from CSS Strings website that's written by David Corbaccio, and hopefully I did not pronounce that name wrong. Now let's go on a little bit of a deep dive on this article and look at the differences and similarities of debounce and throttle. Again, debounce means to delay executing something until after waiting a certain amount of time. The reason for this is because you may be triggering an event like this scroll here multiple times per second. And if you only care about the last event, then you don't want to waste all the calculations for the previous calls. A good real-world example is imagining that you're in an elevator. When the door is about to close, someone sneaks their hand in so they can be with you on the same trip, and this could happen multiple times. When an elevator gets to close, that's the only time it actually moves. Now, let's talk about throttle. This one is probably much simpler to understand. Basically, you can only call a function once within a certain amount of time. Subsequent calls to the function are just ignored if you are within that wait time. Throttle is basically a way to slow things down. Think of the live chat functionality in YouTube. You don't want a person just spamming random messages at very high speed. So maybe you can only send one message every 3 seconds to avoid spam. Other technical use cases where you can use throttle or debounce are watching for events like scrolling, dragging, and window resizing. These events can trigger multiple times in a split second, so you don't want to hammer your function with all these calls, especially if you only care about the last data anyway. I will be linking that article that we just saw down below in the description, so don't forget to check that out. Now that we know the differences between debounce and throttle, let's go ahead and implement them. Alright, so looking at this code sandbox here, which I will link down in the description below so everyone can check it out later, we are going to start implementing the debounce function. I've actually added a reference to go to lodash in here so that people can read how lodash implements or what the options are when calling debounce using lodash. This is a more complex implementation than what we are going to work on with today, right? So let's read the problem description. The debounce function takes in a func and a wait time as parameters. The execution of func is delayed by wait amount of time. When the function is triggered again before wait time elapses, the timer is reset. The func is called with the last arguments provided to the debounce function. Again, if you are doing this in an interview, it would be great if you write down a list of test cases before you start, so you and the interviewer are in the same page when it comes to what the function does, what are the expected results, right? So that's exactly what I've done here. I created a simple function for us to test with. This only calls console log and outputs whatever x is. So what I did here is creating a test variable and calling debounce on do log with 300 millisecond wait time. So this basically returns a new function that I can start using down here, which is a debounce version of my do log. All right, so I've written here that test1 does not trigger because immediately we call test2 right after it, which also does not trigger because immediately we call test3 after it. This one calls do log 3. The reason for that is because we don't call the test function until after the next call to it is after 400 milliseconds. That's why I have a set timeout here, which I put in a call to test4. And this one also triggers because at least 300 milliseconds, which is our wait time, has elapsed when test4 gets called. So hopefully that makes sense, where do-log3 and do-log4 will be triggered, but not the first two. All right, let's go jump into the implementation. Now that we've implemented the debounce function, let's go over what it does. Again, the important thing here is that we need to delay the call to our original function, func, until wait time expires. I've created a timer variable here so that we can store the most recent call to the function. This new function call func accepts any number of arguments and is the one that we will return later. Okay, so I'm actually going to add a comment here to signify what we're trying to do and to make things easier for us in understanding this function. The first step here is to check if the timer is not empty, which means that there was a very recent call to our function. If that's the case, then we disregard the last call by calling clear timeout on our timer. We then call set timeout here to run func with the latest arguments passed after wait amount of time. And that's basically it. As you can see, we are actually already logging the results on the right side of the console here. Let's walk through our test cases. When test1 is called, timer is null and we call set timeout to trigger do-log with 1 as an argument. Immediately after though, we call test2. At this point, our timer has not expired yet and it has been set by our first call, so we call clear timeout to cancel our first set timeout and replace it with this new one. Again, the same scenario happens when test3 is called. However, test3 actually calls do-log because we don't call test again until after 400 milliseconds. And of course, do-log4 gets called because there are also no more calls to test right after it. I'm gonna go clear this console and refresh that just so we can see clearly that log3 is called and log4 is called, but not test1 and test2. Hopefully it's clear what happened here, and it's time for us to move on to our next function, which is throttle. So I've also added the link here for the documentation of throttle and lodash. But again, we are going to implement a very simple version today. Right? So the throttle function takes in a func and a wait time as parameters. The execution of func happens at most once within the wait period. When func is triggered, it is called with the last argument supplied to throttle at the time that it was triggered. So I've actually copied over the test cases from Debounce over here, and let's go over and see how it behaves differently. In here, test1 triggers immediately and calls do-log1. Test2 and test3 both do not trigger because they are called right after and 300 milliseconds has not passed yet. We then have a set timeout that calls test4 and test5 after 400 milliseconds. Here we see that do-log4 gets triggered, but not test5 because it's immediately after test4. Right, so now let's go and work on our implementation. Time to go over this implementation. With throttle, the important thing to do to keep track of is that we are still waiting for our wait time to be over. To do that, we created a variable that will serve as a flag to see if we have recently called the function. This starts out as false because we are currently waiting for the first call. We then have a call func, which we will return later. This accepts any number of arguments as represented by args here that we will pass to our original function. Now, the first check we do here is to see if we're currently throttling the calls. If we are, then we just exit out immediately. If not, then we set the flag to true. Then we schedule setting it back to false after wait time. We do that by calling setTimeout. After that, we just call our original function and pass in args. You can already see in the right console that it's already started logging. But let's step through the code using our test cases. So as we start with test 1, we know that throttling is set to false originally, so we skip this if statement and go right next to flipping the flag to true. We then schedule flipping it back to false, and then we actually call the function. So we call dolog1. For the calls to test 2 and test 3, they both log in this throttling if statement because it has been set to true and not enough time passed as yet, right? In our set timeout down here, which gets triggered after 400 milliseconds, we call test 4, which calls dolog4 because enough time has passed. Again, test 5 is ignored. So clearing the browser here and refreshing it just once again to show that this code actually works. Awesome. So we achieve our goal of having a simple throttle implementation. Great. I hope this has been a helpful video for you in understanding throttle and debounce. As you can tell, we implemented a very simple version here, so you can always extend this to do all sorts of things. I look forward to making more videos like this, and if you have any suggestions on what other utility functions you want me to implement, then leave it down in the comments. Till next time, bye!